Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Supply Chain Insight, powered by CargoNav, your digital tool for end-to-end cargo visibility. I'm Stephanie Montoya-Mariski, Director of Communications and Community Relations for the Port of Long Beach. Today, we're connecting what's happening globally, from cargo flows to fuel prices to what it means for everyday goods, prices, and the movement of cargo here at the Port of Long Beach. In just a moment, I'll introduce Port of Long Beach CEO, Dr. Noel Hacegaba. Today, Noel will also have a very special guest, Jonathan Gold, Vice President of Supply Chain and Customs Policy for the National Retail Federation. After their conversation, we'll open it up to your questions. Please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions now. We will take the questions in order, so it's best to get your questions in as soon as possible. Please be sure to include your name and media outlet affiliation. And a reminder that after the conclusion of the event, the recording will be available on the Port's YouTube channel, youtube.com/Port of Long Beach, under the Live tab. Now, let's bring on Dr. Noel Hacegaba. Noel?
Thank you, Stephanie. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's edition of Supply Chain Insight, powered by CargoNav at the Port of Long Beach. In just a few minutes, I'll be joined by my good friend, John Gold of the National Retail Federation, and together we'll unpack how the conflict in the Middle East is reshaping global supply chain and influencing U.S. trade, and what comes next following the Supreme Court's decision on the IEEPA tariffs. But first, we have some important news to share. Thanks to the efforts of our ILWU workforce and our marine terminal operators, the Port of Long Beach led the nation as the busiest container port for the month of March. While not our strongest March on record, we handled nearly 775,000 TEUs, making us the busiest gateway in North America. Now, that's a 5.2% dip from the same month last year, thanks to tariffs. Global supply chain pressures are indeed mounting due to the Mideast conflict, but March's figures locally were not affected. Imports were flat, down 1.5% to nearly 375,000 TEUs. Exports ticked up 0.5% to more than 100,000 TEUs, and empty containers declined 11% to 296,000 TEUs. Now, this solidified our position for the first quarter. Through the first 3 months of 2026, the Port of Long Beach is number one for Q1, leading all other U.S. ports with nearly 2.5 million TEUs. Yes, we're down 8.6% from Q1 of 2025, but we're still the busiest port in North America. And as I said, these levels of cargo are due to the war and the disruption that it brings. This is still about policy and market timing. With the conflict in the Middle East unresolved, what does the future hold for our cargo volumes, and by extension, the finances of the typical American? Allow me to set the stage. At the Port of Long Beach, all terminals remain open, and there are no direct impacts to operations. But the war in the Middle East continues to add uncertainty for global supply chains. When ships are being rerouted to avoid conflict zones, it sets off a chain reaction. Cargo has to move differently. Routes get longer, costs go up, and ultimately, consumers feel it. We're about 1 week into the ceasefire, but tensions are still escalating. U.S. Navy ships are now blockading Iranian ports, and it's not clear how the ceasefire will play out in those conditions. The Strait of Hormuz carries about 20% of the world's oil, and it's basically closed. The price of oil already hit $100 a barrel for the first time in 4 years, and it's still hovering this week at nearly $100. Here in Los Angeles County, we're seeing gas prices rise to $6 a gallon. And history tells us prices go up fast, but they come down slowly. The U.S. Labor Department's new report found that inflation has hit a 2-year high, and that's why we're seeing growing concern from consumers. Prices rose 3.3% in March alone, led by surging energy prices, which are up by 12.5%. That connection is direct. Higher fuel costs lead to higher transportation costs, and those costs show up in everyday prices. For a while, shippers absorbed rising costs, from fuel spikes to last year's Liberation Day tariffs. That's no longer the case. Today, those costs are being passed along. Across the board, we're seeing new surcharges and higher rates. Major ocean carriers, including MSC, CMA CGM, Ocean Network Express, Maersk, and others, are implementing fuel surcharges and higher rates across key trade lanes. At the same time, shippers are adjusting how they move cargo to manage costs and avoid congestion. According to Reuters, some goods that typically move from Asia to Europe are now being rerouted, traveling by vessel and then by air to Los Angeles, simply to control costs. And again, those costs don't stay in the supply chain. Amazon is adding a 3.5% seller surcharge for fuel and logistics. The U.S. Postal Service plans to launch an 8% temporary increase. UPS and FedEx have also announced fuel surcharges of their own. On the trucking side, fuel surcharges are up 25%. The Harbor Trucking Association, which serves the West Coast, says these fuel surcharges may be preventing some local motor carriers from recovering costs, and they continue to move goods through the San Pedro Bay Ports complex. And here's the bottom line. What happens in the supply chain doesn't stay in the supply chain. It shows up in the price people pay every day. Not just higher price tags, but fewer discounts, higher free shipping thresholds, and slower delivery times. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the resolution of the OOCL Sunflower incident. Many thanks to our first responders, Long Beach Container Terminal, and our ILWU workforce for their swift, coordinated response in safely managing a rare and challenging situation. Their efforts helped protect both cargo and crew after 32 containers went overboard en route to the Port of Long Beach. The OOCL Sunflower safely departed on April 2nd. Once again, the Port of Long Beach kept its commitment to safety and flexed its resilience muscle to keep cargo moving. Now, to more good news. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers allocated nearly $70 million to the Port of Long Beach from the Federal Harbor Maintenance Tax Fund, a record investment. This funding will strengthen critical infrastructure, improve safety, and enhance efficiency as we continue to build the port of the future here in Long Beach. It's part of a broader $148 million package shared with the Port of Los Angeles. This is also the result of sustained advocacy over many years. Back in December, I testified before the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, Water Resources and Environment Subcommittee, to voice my support for reauthorizing the Water Resources Development Act to include this allocation. The Port of Long Beach plays a vital role in goods movement and national security, and it's important we get our equitable share of the harbor maintenance tax, to which we contribute more than $300 million annually. We are grateful to Senators Alex Padilla and Adam Schiff and Representative Robert Garcia and all of our congressional leaders and federal partners for helping to make this possible. And we look forward to building on our strong working relationship with the Army Corps of Engineers. We're also marking 4 years of the Clean Truck Fund rate. So far, we've generated more than $155 million and already reinvested more than $62 million in zero-emissions trucks and infrastructure. This is how we turn policy into progress. I recently visited the Tesla Gigafactory in Nevada. They're building a Class 8 heavy-duty electric truck with up to 500 miles of range and the ability to recover up to 60% of a full charge in 30 minutes. This technology is advancing quickly, and driver interest is growing. It's a game changer for truckers. And now, let me leave you with a few important takeaways. First, continued instability in the Strait of Hormuz will keep pressure on energy prices, and by extension, consumer prices. Second, this is a pivotal moment for energy. Rising fuel costs are accelerating the case for domestic renewable energy and energy independence. At the Port of Long Beach, we're not waiting. We're investing in zero-emissions equipment, clean shipping corridors, and offshore wind infrastructure like our proposed Pier Wind Terminal. We're not just adapting to the future, we're building the port of the future today. Now, before I bring on today's guests, I will make a few remarks for our Spanish language media partners who are watching. Hola, tenemos muy buenas noticias. Gracias a los esfuerzos de nuestra fuerza laboral ILWU y los operadores de terminales, una vez más, somos el líder como el puerto más concurrido de los Estados Unidos. Durante los primeros 3 meses del 2026, movimos casi 2.5 millones de TEUs, el volumen más alto en la nación. Aún así, los conflictos en el Medio Oriente obligan a los barcos a cambiar de ruta, Esto reduce el suministro de petróleo y sube el precio del combustible. Y los costos de combustibles más altos se reflejan en los precios de todos los días. Lo que sucede en la cadena de suministro no se queda en la cadena de suministro. Si está interesado en entrevistarme en español, por favor póngase en contacto con Art Marroquin en art.marroquin@polb.com. Now, to help connect the dots between the supply chain and what consumers are seeing in stores, we're joined by my good friend Jonathan Gold, Vice President for the National Retail Federation. John, welcome to Supply Chain Insight.
Thanks, Noel. Good to see you.
Thanks. John, the National Retail Federation's Global Port Tracker is a great tool for judging the ebb and flow of cargo trends. What does the latest tracker report tell us about the outlook for the supply chain, given the impacts of restricted commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz?
Thanks, Noel. So we recently put out our latest Global Port Tracker for April 2026 with our partner Hackett Associates. The forecast is for imports at major U.S. container ports expected to remain below last year's levels for at least the first half of 2026. The forecast currently extends through August. We typically do it for 6 months out. So the import volume at major U.S. container ports is not being significantly affected by the conflict in Iran, but ocean carriers are seeing related increases in fuel costs that could eventually affect the retailers and their customers, as you talked about in your opening. Just because retailers don't import a lot of merchandise from the Middle East doesn't mean the U.S. supply chain isn't affected by the turmoil there. The supply chain is global, and disruptions anywhere along it can have ripple effects, whether it's rerouting of vessels, equipment out of position, higher fuel costs for shippers, or rising gas prices that leave less money in consumers' pockets. Retailers continue to monitor the situation on a daily basis and are working with their transportation partners to minimize any impact. In the meantime, retailers continue to face rising tariffs and continued trade policy uncertainty that put downward pressure on imports and upward pressure on prices. We still see a strong consumer demand in 2026. The consumer remains the bright spot in our economy, despite all the various policy and geopolitical challenges that we're faced. We released our annual retail sales forecast a couple of weeks ago and believe we will see an increase in retail sales of 4.4% in 2026. However, we recognize there are ongoing headwinds, including the situation in the Middle East, that could certainly impact consumer spending in the future.
Thanks for sharing that, John. I can tell you that your global tracker is even more popular than usual, given all the activity that's unfolding in the global supply chain. But thank you for sharing that insight. And I think it's important for our viewers to understand that notwithstanding some of these headwinds that are cascading across the global supply chain, you're still looking at a positive year-over-year increase, which is what we've been projecting here in Long Beach as well. And as you pointed out, what we're seeing so far. Let me move on to the next question. How are your members navigating the effects of the escalating situation in the Middle East? For example, freight surcharges, higher costs of fuel for the goods moving industry, and what options do they really have?
Thanks. So, retailers are continuing to work with their transportation partners to work through the current situation, including the additional surcharges. Many have these situations spelled out in their contracts, their annual contracts. So they're working through those issues. We know they're all working on, finalizing some of those annual contracts right now.
Yeah.
So this certainly is having an impact on some of those negotiations. We were pleased to see the Federal Maritime Commission prevent the early implementation of some of these surcharges last week and the week prior. We agree that importers and cargo owners need clear information on the scope and purpose of any new surcharges and encourage the FMC to continue to evaluate those potential surcharges that carriers are looking to implement. Unfortunately, as we've seen with previous supply chain disruptions, it's not easy to quickly pivot, especially as the challenge and disruption persists. I think as we talked about, the ripple effect these disruptions have, as folks have to look for, rerouting of cargo, which takes time and money.
Yeah.
So it's a challenge, but this is something where, retailers continue to work with their partners, their sourcing partners, their transportation partners to ensure that products are on the store shelves when the consumer expects them to be there.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing those insights, John. I know that you are in very close communication with your members multiple times a day, every day, so we appreciate that insight. What's your sense of how small businesses in particular are being impacted right now due to the tariff situation, the rising oil prices, and everything else that's going on around this?
Yeah, definitely an important question that we need to discuss. There's a lot of focus on, how the large retailers are responding to the situations. But, small retailers make up the bulk of the retail community. And something we've been focusing on quite a bit, over the past year on the policy challenges that we've been facing. So, while retailers of all formats and sizes are being impacted by a variety of external factors, the nation's small retailers are certainly experiencing disproportionate impact. Retailers try to be nimble and adjust when adversity hits, but there are certainly more challenges for the smaller retailers to be able to quickly respond to the day's crisis. Retailers already operate on an extremely slim margin, and small businesses in particular don't have the ability to absorb cost increases and typically have to pass those along to the end consumer. As we saw with the tariffs that are now seen because of rising fuel costs. So certainly the smaller retailers are more impacted by some of these immediate changes than larger folks are.
And yet, as you pointed out, we're seeing everyone across the supply chain, the economy for that matter, flexing their resilience muscle. The American consumer in continuing to buy goods at an elevated price, and these small businesses and importers who are now having to grapple with these additional fees. Will we see, this is another question we get often, John, will we see more front loading when importers move to stock up ahead of impending tariffs or other issues? How are inventory levels in general right now, and do you expect more front loading?
Yeah, unclear if we're going to see front loading again this year. Obviously, there was a significant amount of front loading in advance of the global tariffs taking effect last year. We also had the situation on the East Coast with the labor contract that also led to some front loading there. While the IEEPA tariffs have been struck down by the court, the administration has launched new Section 301 trade investigations that could lead to more tariffs, and we have the Section 122 tariffs that are in place as well. But inventory levels remain in a good place for retailers. While they did a significant amount of front loading last year, they're now working on restocking and preparing for the summer selling season. We're already into spring, so now we're focused on summer selling.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It was the topic of the day for the last year until recently, but it's still having an effect. So on that topic, let's talk tariffs. How has the Supreme Court's decision to remove the IEEPA tariffs affecting your members? With the launch, for example, of the refund system portal, how are your members managing? Are they hopeful about getting the refunds? How is that going, and what are you hearing?
Sure. So, with the ruling by the Supreme Court in February, importers are no longer paying the IEEPA tariffs. However, importers are still paying a wide range of other tariffs, from the normal baseline most favored nation tariff to the Section 232 tariffs the administration put in place last year on a wide variety of goods from steel, aluminum, and copper, automobiles, wooden furniture, including kitchen cabinets and bathroom vanities. On top of that, we've got the still existing Section 301 tariffs on China that were implemented during the first Trump administration, and the new Section 122 10% tariff that went into effect. That's going to be short term until late July 24th. Those 10% tariffs were put in place to once the IEEPA tariffs were ruled illegal. But again, they're temporary until we get through some of these other Section 301 investigations, which were announced on structural excess capacity and forced labor, which could result in additional tariffs, this summer. We're actually filing comments today on both of those investigations, and certainly hope the administration doesn't follow through again with broad tariffs on the economies that are subject to the investigation. I certainly think there are other paths to take when trying to address some of these trade-related issues. But I believe all importers of record who are eligible for refunds are expecting to get a refund as directed by the decisions from the Court of International Trade. We continue to follow CBP as they're set to roll out their phase 1 of the Consolidated Administration and Processing of Entries, their CAPE system for the IEEPA refunds, which is set to go live on April 20th, next week. It's going to be a slow process, I think, to start as they work through issues. But, I think importers of all sizes are really looking at the system, trying to understand it, trying to make sure they are able to get back the monies that were illegally taken from them because of the IEEPA tariffs. But we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. John, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. And I can't think of anyone better suited for this time in particular to come and share your insights. I'm going to pass it on to Stephanie, who's going to take questions from our viewing audience. Thanks again, John. I appreciate you.
Right. And
Thanks,
thank
Noel.
you for both of the conversation for both of you. But just keep in mind, we're not done yet. We're going to open up to questions to both Noel and John. And thank you in advance to those who already submitted early. But if you haven't submitted your questions yet, you'll notice, again, the Q&A function on your screen. And please write in your name and your media outlet affiliation. Write your questions and send. We'll give preference to those questions who came in first. And again, we do have some questions that came in early, Noel. So let's get right to it because we have quite a few. Our first question comes from Stas Margonis from the American Journal of Transportation. Noel, he asks, the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association reports a decline of U.S. import market share by West Coast ports, including Long Beach and Los Angeles, losing cargo to Atlantic and Gulf Coast ports. Does the Iran war, the cargo backups, the access problems through the Suez, and higher ocean carrier fuel surcharges create an opportunity for Long Beach to pick up additional Asian imports that can go intermodal to Midwest customers?
Stas, thank you for your question. We're certainly prepared at the Port of Long Beach to handle more cargo should the need arise. Our intermodal system, which we're continually enhancing, is built to serve all of North America. And if we are needed to handle that additional volume, we will do so. But there are so many reasons than the current Middle East situation for shippers to use the San Pedro Bay Ports complex. And we're working to make them aware of those reasons, such as speed to market. Here at the Port of Long Beach, we're always open, we're always moving, and always ready for more cargo.
Great. Thank you, Noel. Our second question comes from Ari Ash of the Journal of Commerce. He says, at what point do higher fuel costs and geopolitical disruptions stop being mainly a cost issue and start becoming a volume issue for the port?
Thanks for your question, Ari. As prices rise, demand slows, basic economics, and it's inevitable. If that happens, volumes could be affected throughout the supply chain, including the San Pedro Bay. But as we heard from John Gold, in spite of the headwinds that are cascading across the global supply chain, the outlook for the balance of the year is still positive. Now, I recognize that things can continue to change. For example, the conflict in the Middle East can continue to escalate and persist. But when you look at the resilience of the American consumer, it gives us reasons to continue to be hopeful for the U.S. market. We would expect in the long run that after the situation cools, we would see volumes to rise again. And certainly what John and his Globe Tracker is pointing to is what we're projecting. And again, this is why at the Port of Long Beach, we're building the port of the future. And every day, every week, every month, we're adding to our capacity so that we're prepared for that additional volume.
All right. Now, this is for John Gold. The Journal of Commerce's Bill Mongaluso asks, in the April Global Port Tracker, the NRF forecasts year-over-year decline in monthly import volumes in March, April, July, and August, but increases in imports in May and June. Why is the Global Port Tracker forecasting increases in May and June?
Thanks. Appreciate the question, Bill. I think as we're looking at the year moving forward, obviously last year, I hate to say this, but the past 5 years, it's been very difficult to kind of predict year on year what's been going on because we've had so many different disruptions. I mean, obviously with all the front loading that happened last year, that's one of the reasons why you're going to see kind of a leveling off of the imports this year, as you saw things tail down last year after the IP tariffs were announced in April. You saw drops in May and June. So you'll see an increase now because you're not going to have that immediate hit at those timeframes. But also you've got the start of the holiday shipping season starting in May and June as well. So that's why you're going to see a bit of an uptick there. Over the years, retailers have spread out their holiday shipping season, the peak season. It's not all kind of in the later 3 months. It's kind of spread out now, and part of that is because consumers are buying holiday merchandise earlier and earlier as well. So retailers are wanting to ensure they have the products ready to go and on the store shelves in late fall when consumers start their holiday shopping.
Great. Another one for you, John. This is from Edwin Lopez at Supply Chain Dive. His main question is about the broader economic spillover from the Iran war and whether or not you see that affecting retail spending forecasts and therefore container flows.
Yeah, I think as I talked about it earlier with Noel, it's, we put out our yearly forecast a few weeks ago, looking at 4.4% growth on the year. But obviously, with all the different headwinds that are ongoing, we'll have to continue to evaluate that and see what's happening. If the conflict ends, we could see that can be maintained. If it continues and we see those fuel prices continue to rise and have more of an impact on the consumer, that's something we're going to have to take into consideration. But as of right now, we're still maintaining that we're looking at another positive year on retail sales, but recognizing that there are a number of different headwinds that could impact that going forwards.
Thank you, John. And for Noel, this is from Paul Avery at World Cargo News. He asks, did any container services move calls from terminals at the Port of Los Angeles to Long Beach over the first quarter? What other factors led to Long Beach overtaking Los Angeles?
Paul, thanks for your question. Those changes happen fairly routinely despite what is happening globally. These ocean carriers operate under global networks, and so they're always looking for ways to optimize their services. For example, just a couple of weeks ago, MSC announced that they were going to be optimizing their services on the West Coast. So that happens fairly routinely. When you look at our container volumes here in San Pedro Bay and you parse out LA and Long Beach, what you notice is a difference in the level of imports, exports, and empty containers. And those changes are principally the reason why there are months when we're ahead of Los Angeles and there are months when they're ahead of us. But I think what's important here is that the value proposition that both ports, LA and Long Beach, offer through the San Pedro Bay Ports Complex, when you think about the scale, the infrastructure, the intermodal connectivity, it's hard to rival what we offer here. And so this is why we're always talking about our plans for the future. Here in Long Beach, for example, we're guided by our bold new 2050 vision. We are planning to double our container throughput by 2050, and along the way, add capacity, increase connections to the nation's key inland rail hubs, and we're building the port of the future.
Great. Jonathan, if you could take this one for us. It's from Alejandra Carranza from Supply Chain Dive. She asks, can you elaborate on how retailers are working with their transport partners to navigate freight surcharges?
Yeah, again, I think because a lot of those surcharges are within their contracts, they're continuing to have the conversations about whether or not they're going to apply, how do they work through that. So it's just ongoing conversations they're having with their providers, trying to work through those issues.
Great. And we're going to wrap it up with one more question for you, Noel. You had mentioned that the Port of Long Beach had sought more funding for some time now from the harbor maintenance tax. What do you think changed and brought more funding our way?
Sustained advocacy over many years. Advocacy is a team sport, and when you have a whole industry advocating on behalf of strengthening the nation's transportation system and the supply chain, especially at a time like this, at a critical moment where ports and goods movement in general are recognized as vital to the national economy and vital to the nation's resilience and national security, it becomes increasingly important to help ports like ours make those investments so that we can support our nation and our federal partners in making the nation's transportation system more resilient, energy independent, and improve our ability to move more cargo to support the nearly 3 million jobs that are supported by the Port of Long Beach nationally.
Great. Thank you, Noel. And thank you to everyone, especially those reporters who joined us today and asked those very thoughtful questions. Back to you, Noel.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Stephanie, and many thanks to John Gold from National Retail Federation. Thank you again, John, for joining us. This concludes this edition of Supply Chain Insight, brought to you by the Port of Long Beach. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you next time when we may have a special announcement for you. Thanks again. Have a great day.